Prior to this transfer, I had only dabbled in working with digital records, so the help I received from our first digital archivist, Tim, was invaluable. Although there could have been much eye-rolling on his part, he never did, well, not in front of me anyway, and he patiently took me through the steps I needed to work on the 93 floppies and the 9 CD-ROMs. Tim installed FTK Imager, a forensic toolkit, on my computer. This way I could make a verifiable disk image. With FTK Imager, I could retrieve the files off the obsolete carrier and work on a virtual identical copy. This overcame other general issues in that the data would not degrade and the speed was quicker, which made working on the large volumes of floppies so much easier. With the file safely extracted from the original media, we could also check what was on each of the disks without damage to the original and decide which series to put the various files into. One disk had a virus on it, but Tim assured me a virus from 1996 was not going to do much damage today. By using FTK Imager, I was still able to work with the files on this particular disk. The Tasmanian Police records of the Port Arthur massacre had the highest access restriction our Archives Act allows an agency to place on any records. They are an E75 access restriction, which means they are closed for 75 years, and the E means that only one person or position can grant access. In this case, only the Commissioner of Police can grant access. This caused us another issue. With such a huge amount of digital files and a basic digital preservation system, how could we securely store the data? We stored all digital files on 2 hard drives of 8 terabytes, so 2 identical drives, and 2 sets of LTO tape, which is linear tape open tapes. Everything was packed in Baggett's specification. Baggett's specification is a hierarchical file packaging format for storage and transfer of digital content. A bag had just enough structure to enclose descriptive tags and a payload. This means that with a simple set of tools, we can verify that the bag is complete and that the content had not changed. Every 2 years for the hard drive and every 4 years for the LTOs, we will retrieve the storage media and test the bags. If a bag fails, there is a checksum mismatch, we can see if the other hard drive has the correct file. Once we have the correct file, we can restore it and revalidate the bag. After this testing, we could also refresh the media. We're also keeping the fragile formats at least until we do this first check. And we're also working with the Tasmanian Government to progress our business case for proper digital storage and preservation. And if anybody would like some information on Baggett, Tim has provided me with a link to the Library of Congress, so please see me afterwards. Once we had transferred the files, had the transfer mostly completed and the paperwork was ready to send back to Tasmanian Police, we had a decision to make regarding our website. Usually we display a list of our holdings on our website. We display the series but may restrict the items if there are any privacy concerns. In this case, the series themselves had information I knew may cause anxiety to those who had been involved. But what about government transparency? Here was our dilemma. Would we be adding numerous right to information requests to the police? And more importantly, would we be causing distress to those involved? It had only been 20 years and the massacre is still very raw for many people, especially in Tasmania. Would some of our descriptions cause distress? The answer I knew was yes. This may not be the case in 15 to 20 years' time, but I knew it was still the case now. I knew people who were caring for loved ones who had been first responders at Port Arthur and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. When the 20th anniversary was approaching and one TV channel was advertising a documentary about the Port Arthur massacre, my daughter jumped up in a panic to ring her friend whose husband had been a first responder. She told her friend to make sure he wasn't watching that particular channel. The wife was very distressed and thanked my daughter for telephoning. She said other friends had also called. Knowing this, what could I do? Government transparency is important. I sounded out the advice of the State Archivist and also the manager of the State Library and Archives Service, who provide access to our state archives. In the interest of transparency, we could not pretend we didn't have the records. After discussions with the manager of the State Library and Archives Service, we decided to not display the series I had created, but to create an overarching series which we could display. In it, we stated we held the Tasmanian Police records of the Port Arthur massacre, with access only granted in writing from the Commissioner of Police. So we weren't saying we didn't have the records, but we also gave few details. And this is certainly something we can revisit later, and there will come a time when we will display a list of our holdings. The paperwork is currently with the State Archivist, so the overarching series hasn't displayed yet, but it will very soon. So, lessons learned. When you spend so much time on such an important project, it is often the case you look back and think how far we have come. What were the lessons we learnt? There is no way we could have had a successful process without bringing in other specialists in their field. As archivists, we're not and cannot always be the specialist. We have to rely on others and their knowledge. We need to identify and sometimes rely on the capabilities of the depositor and follow a holistic approach to our records. In this particular case, we brought in many specialists, including the Commissioner of Police. We shouldn't be wary of calling on the capabilities of others who can add value to our records. And finally, I hope you will indulge me for just a moment. I wanted to share with you a more human side to these records. You can't just really talk about the Port Arthur massacre without some mention of the overwhelming sadness of what happened on that day. I have already mentioned the duplication within the records, and because of this, I had to read many statements matching against other statements, and yes, I probably did read a little too much. While I was doing this, I came across a statement which was a little different to the others. It was different in that it wasn't written in discussion with police. Police statements are just that, statements of fact, as they should be. No emotion, just fact. One person in the Broad Arrow Cafe at the time of the shooting had been too traumatised to talk to the police. On their return home, they started writing down what they had seen and what they felt, and they sent it to police. They described the scene in the cafe, the conversations with others as they tried to help those injured. They waited for help and did what they could. There was the added fear that the gunman may return. It wasn't an overly dramatic statement, it just told the story. But it brought home the humanness to this transfer of records. I sat at my desk with tears in my eyes. If ever there was a moment where I needed reminding why archivists do what we do, here it was right in front of me. I couldn't do anything for them except to make sure their account of what happened that day was preserved. Thank you.